Guide paper 7. Helen Keller is a blind little girl and Frederick Douglass is an American slave. He learned how to read and write from his mistress. Helen Keller learns how to use sign language with her little doll. That paper was scored as a 1. Although the student introduces a topic that follows generally from the task, the student demonstrates little understanding of the texts. The response demonstrates an attempt to use evidence, but the ideas are developed with minimal evidence. The response exhibits little attempted organization and lacks a formal style. It demonstrates an emerging command of conventions with some errors that may hinder the comprehension. Guide paper 8 is another 1. The student writes, the author's central idea is that life isn't what it always seems. Words always has a meaning. You just have to find it. Helen Keller. You have to find the time to learn from anyone. This was scored as a 1. The response introduced a topic in a manner that follows generally from the task, but demonstrates little understanding of the texts. There's an attempt to use minimal evidence, but little attempted organization and no concluding statement. There's an emerging command of conventions with some errors that may hinder comprehension. Guide paper 9. In both stories, it's cool because you're blind and deaf, and you can't really know what stuff is and spell it. Many slaves don't know how to read or write. The student there got a 0. The response demonstrates a lack of comprehension of the task and little understanding of the texts. There's no evidence of organization. There's imprecise language, no concluding statement, a lack of command of conventions, and frequent errors that hinder comprehension and make it pretty hard to read. The last guide paper is guide paper 10. This is another 0. The student writes, in both of the passages, the story of my life and narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, one of the differences was that the setting was very different, and in the story of my life, the kid got a doll. That's scored as a 0 because the student demonstrates a lack of comprehension of the task, no evidence of organization, no concluding statement, an emerging command of conventions that do get in the way of comprehension. Now we're going to take a look at the practice set. There are 5 papers in the practice set. Please take a minute to read and score the practice responses. Practice set 1 reads as follows. In the story of my life, the author didn't want to learn how to read at first. By the end of the passage, she realized that everything had a name, and she became curious about a lot of these names and wanted to learn more. In Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, the author had always wanted to learn to read, but being a slave and wanting to learn to read was not easy. The story of my life was about Helen Keller and how in the beginning of the classes she was taught many things by a special teacher. She didn't want to learn anything, but when she realized that everything had a name, she became curious and wanted to learn more. In the other passage I read, the narrator was a slave who always wanted to be free and learn to read. When he began to read fluently, he was reading all the time. His owner did not like the fact that his slave could read. The owner's wife was the very same way. Whenever she saw him reading a newspaper, she would snatch it out of his hands with a furious look on her face. Both narrators had dreams that were very hard to accomplish, but they both achieved everything that they had set out for. In both of the stories that I read today, the topic was the wanting of knowledge. Frederick Douglass became a free man and was able to read even though he was a slave. Helen Keller was blind and deaf, but she learned sign language and was a very intelligent person. Practice paper 1 was scored as a 3. The response clearly introduced a topic in a manner that follows from the task and the purpose. It demonstrated a grade-appropriate analysis of the texts. The topic was developed with relevant details from the texts. The response exhibits clear organization with the use of appropriate transitions. A formal style was established and maintained using domain-specific vocabulary. The concluding statement follows from the topic and the information presented, and the response demonstrates grade-appropriate command of conventions. All of those are elements of a Level 3 paper. Practice Paper 2. In The Story of My Life by Helen Keller and Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave by Frederick Douglass, a central idea is formed that comprehension of words is important. Understanding words was important for Helen because she was blind and deaf and couldn't communicate with others. Once she understood that everything had a name, she was eager to learn. When she understood this, she realized that what she did to the doll and started to feel sad. Word comprehension was important for Helen Keller. Frederick Douglass was a slave, and his mistress refused to teach him to read and write after a while. But it was important to him because he wanted to prove that slavery and education could go hand in hand. He was so desperate to learn that he would do errands extra quick so that one of the boys in the street could teach him in exchange for food. Frederick took his book with him everywhere just in case he had extra time or would find a teacher. There is many similarities and differences between the motives of these two people to learn. Both Helen Keller and Frederick Douglass wanted knowledge. They had to have teachers teach them instead of teaching themselves. But Helen Keller had a teacher, while Frederick Douglass had to take matters into his own hands. Also, the two had to learn in different ways, for Helen Keller was blind and deaf and couldn't see or hear words, and Frederick Douglass just learned to read out of a book since he already knew how to talk. These two people wanted to learn how to understand words. It was important to them both in different ways. This paper was scored as a 4. The response clearly introduced a topic in a manner that followed logically from the task. It demonstrated an insightful analysis of the text that was varied. The student used a sustained use of relevant, well-chosen evidence from the texts. There was clear organization exhibited by the skillful use of appropriate and varied transitions. The response maintains a formal style using grade-appropriate and domain-specific vocabulary. There's a concluding statement that follows clearly from the topic and the information presented, and the student demonstrates grade-appropriate command of conventions with few errors. Most of those elements are 4s, maybe one or 2 3s included in the bunch, but overall, holistically, the student is scored as a 4. Guide Paper 3. The Story of My Life and Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, share many similarities and differences. Some of the similarities between these stories are they both have difficult lives. They also both are permanently affected by some of these hardships. Their similarities create a central idea. Many people, young and old, face difficult times in their lives. These two people went through a lot, but they gave it their best shot. The differences they have are Frederick was a slave, but Helen wasn't. Another difference is Frederick was able to learn easy, but Helen had trouble. This was scored as a 2. The response introduced a topic in a manner that follows generally from the task and purpose. The response demonstrates a literal comprehension of the text, an attempt to use evidence. There's an attempted organization with inconsistent use of transitions. A formal style is not maintained. There's inconsistent use of domain-specific vocabulary. And the response demonstrates grade-appropriate command of conventions with occasional errors that do not hinder comprehension. Practice Paper 4. In the stories The Story of My Life and Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, there are similarities and differences. The central idea of these stories is shared. The central idea is that once you understand what things mean, life seems more special and alive. Helen Keller could not see or hear anything. She had a homeschool aide who taught her what everything surrounding her was. She learned what things were, like water, sunshine, clothing, objects, and living things were. She felt no repentance for her bad actions until she understood what she had really done. Knowing about her surroundings brought a new light into her life forever after. Frederick Douglass, too, was touched by the wonder of understanding his life and literature. Although he was a slave for life, he had the ambition to learn to read. Since his mistress would surely be enraged by his skill, he would gradually learn from others. He could understand what each word and each letter meant, and it made him feel good. Slavery for life was his sentence, but it did not stop him from persisting. Once he could understand, things meant more to him. However, Douglas was only a slave he could see and hear, while Helen Keller was forevermore enslaved to her condition. Frederick sought help while Helen just received it, although a new meaning of life was the outcome of both of them. Practice paper 4 was scored as a 3. The response clearly introduces a topic in a manner that follows from the task and purpose. It demonstrates grade-appropriate analysis of the texts. The topic is developed with relevant details from the texts. It exhibits clear organization throughout. A formal style is established and maintained using stylistically sophisticated, domain-specific language throughout. There's a concluding statement that follows from the topic and information presented. And the response demonstrates grade-appropriate command of conventions with occasional errors that do not hinder comprehension. The student is scored primarily in the level 3 column. There's one level 4, but holistically it's a level 3 that the student's given. Finally, practice paper 5. In the stories The Story of My Life and Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, they both want you to want to learn. Both of the stories have somebody that is not equal to other people or feel like they're not. The student's response was a 1. The response introduces a topic that follows generally from the task, which is a 2, but the response demonstrates little understanding of the texts, provides no evidence, little attempted organization, and lacks a concluding statement. The response demonstrates an emerging command of conventions with some errors. That last point is a 2, but overall the student is scored as a 1.